Good afternoon, students. It's Friday afternoon, and I'm recording this video for you on Lesson 5. Some interesting comments, although I have to say that I would prefer that the comments come in earlier. For this coming week, we'll be doing much more text study, and I'd like for you to bring the comments in earlier in the week so that we all have an opportunity to have a discussion about them. We haven't been able to do that much in the discussion arena these past few weeks. I'd like to increase that. The reading is a little different, and I gave you kind of an extended introduction to the reading as well on prophecy in general. With regard to this week, there were these three questions that I'd asked you to look at, Brettler and Kugel, on the book of Joshua and maybe a little bit of Judges as well, and to try to compare them a bit. My own sense is that it's not that they disagree, as I wrote in my comments, but they reflect some different approaches to what they want to do in this book, How to Read the Bible. Brettler has a much more limited set of issues that he wants to deal with. Kugel is much more, I would say, comprehensive. And some of the stuff in Brettler is interesting, the use of the Hebrew word kol at the beginning, in which he tries to understand the interest of one, at least, of the documents in the book of Joshua, but then shows that even though it says that all of the land had been captured, in the end there are other strands, literary strands, which show something quite different. But the books of Joshua and Judges reflect an ongoing controversy in biblical scholarship, which has to do with who were these Israelites? Where did they come from? If you're a Jew, you ask the question, well, where did I come from? What were my origins? What were my ethnic origins, biological, geographical, and so on? And there seems to be some skepticism about whether Jews actually ever were in Egypt. The whole story of the Exodus, the story of the oppression by the Egyptians and so on. There are others that say, well, maybe a very small band of Israelites or Jews or Hebrews were there, but certainly not the bulk of the Israelite people. And then there's a question of who became the Israelite people. Were they just Canaanites? Were they Israelite Canaanites? Were they a special group of Canaanites? Were they separate biologically? Were they a separate tribe there? And I have to say, since I've been involved in this work over the last 40 or 50 years, there have been a lot of theories, but not a whole lot of compelling answers to the question. Lots of interesting theories about it. And in both in Brettler and in Kugel, you get a little sense of what these different theories are. But they all lead me to the next question, which I asked was the story of the Exodus from Egypt and the giving of the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai. That whole story, why did that story become such a central part of Jewish culture, Israelite culture throughout? And why would any people want to have the beginning of their story have to do with their being enslaved? Now, of course, the end of the story is they're not enslaved, and God does release them from slavery. I tried to give a little bit of an answer in the discussion thread, but I'm still a little perplexed about it too. It does lead to a kind of unique sense of who the Israelite people were, later on who the Jewish people became, that their sense of glory and triumph and so on might be a little bit different from that you find with other groups. I'm not sure. I'm not such an expert on other groups' stories of origin, but this does seem to be coming from such a humble place. And certainly the God of Israel is one who is a God over the Egyptians, and that's a big deal. And the God of Israel is one who is related to the desert, and I think that's a big deal as well. The wandering in the desert is a big deal. But it's also the case, as I wrote in the discussion thread, that the actual conquering of the land of Canaan in Joshua and Judges, and later on continues into the book of Samuel, as far as Jewish history is concerned, as far as Jewish tradition, Jewish culture, and even the Bible itself, isn't it interesting that there is no holiday which celebrates the actual entry into the land of Canaan? We have holidays of the Exodus, we have holidays of the wandering in the desert, we have holidays of the giving of the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai, But there is no holiday in which we come together and talk about the conquering of the land. Now, later on, we can develop homiletical reasons why that might be a good thing or not. But in fact, it's something at least to note. Now, that process of getting into the land and conquering it, if that was something that ever happened, and sustaining it and settling the land and then being in charge of the land, that whole process takes a long time, and probably not until David's time, when he finally defeats the Philistines with Saul. That is not completed, that whole episode. And in fact, as you read through the book of Samuel, you probably noticed, some of you might not have seen the first time when you've read it earlier, that there were actually, from that time, two kingdoms of Israel, a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. They didn't have separate names until after Solomon. But David had to become king in two different places. He became king in Judah in the south, and then he was enthroned as king in the north in a whole separate ceremony. So it's a very demographically, geographically, topographically, the north of Israel and the south of Israel are actually quite different, and they did split after the days of Solomon. So I don't have a great answer to that question, other than it has become a formative element. Why it happened in the first place, I don't know, but it has become a very important formative element in Jewish tradition. The Exodus and out of slavery and Passover and all that goes with it. And it's just something that I think it's interesting to remark. Finally, the stories of Saul and David that I asked you to look at and to reflect on a little bit, and the wonderful essay by Tzvi Adar, gives you this one book of the Bible which is a continuous narrative. Now, it doesn't mean that it's not made up of some separate documents, but it gives you a continuous narrative. And each of the characters in this book is so interesting for me, just as I look at the individuals. Abigail is such an interesting character. Michal is an interesting character. And, of course, David and Saul and Jonathan. And Jonathan's relationship to David. And David is this very tough guy. He's certainly the sweet singer of Israel, but he is such a manipulator. And it's clear from my reading of that story, it's clear. I mean, I think it's clear that Jonathan was indeed in love with David. I don't think David was in love with Jonathan, but Jonathan clearly seems to me to be in love with David. The whole idea of David's enemies, one after the other, die, and David never kills them himself. Somebody else kills them. Until he himself is wounded so deeply by this process of all of David's enemies getting killed, then the final enemy that he loved more deeply than anybody else, his son Absalom, is killed by Joab, because recognizing that he was such a threat to David's power, but David no longer had any control over that. There is a principle that Tzvi Adar talks about called midah keneged midah, that the Bible doesn't say David does anything wrong, except perhaps with the census, but it punishes him in something called an intrinsic principle of retribution, which means just as he did, so gets done to him. So he violates various things, and they get violated, and he gets punished as a result. We see that throughout the life of David. We saw it also in the book of Genesis, with the figure of Jacob and Joseph, particularly the figure of Jacob. Nowhere does it say that Jacob did anything wrong when he lied to his father, saying that he was Esau. On the other hand, Jacob himself is punished deeply when his sons come back and lie to him, showing him the coat of many colors dipped in blood, and say, a chaya ra'a achalatu, a wild animal ate Joseph, and that's why we're not bringing him back. And there's all kinds of other things, disruption, that Jacob caused disruptions in his own family life, so he is destined to have Joseph causing these disruptions. And a lot of the same elements are found in the story of David and Bathsheba. A lot of these stories come back later to haunt David. He's a very interesting and difficult character. People say, well, how has that character become the great king of Israel? And why, the more interesting question is, why do we still maintain all of these stories about him which are less than flattering? And I don't have a great answer to that other than question one, were they really less than flattering in terms of the people who told those stories at that time? Maybe power is more important than ethics for them. Maybe the fact that he was unsuccessful originally with Uriah, and also, but there is always through the narrator is showing that Uriah is when he comes back the first time says this incredible thing, how can I go home and be with my wife when my colleagues and troops are out at war? When David has been staying home, not at war, and in the end, David is is culpable in going after Bathsheba, perhaps because he didn't go to war. There's all kinds of ironies throughout these stories, so I read them really from a literary perspective, which doesn't deal so much with the historical elements. There certainly are historical elements, but we certainly can't learn much about the historical David from these stories. We're going to come up next week and move into the world of prophecy, and I've given you these readings, and we're going to be studying carefully some texts from the book of Amos and the book of Jeremiah. The individual of and we're going to be looking at the question of the classical prophet or the literary prophet, or the what we think of as an Israelite prophet, like Amos and Isaiah and Hosea and Jeremiah and so on. They're very interesting figures who have a powerful political role as well as a powerful personal role with the people. They represent a certain period of Jewish history, and they were active during that period of Jewish history and were not active later. And we'll see that one of their roles was, and perhaps the basic role was that of challenging the status quo. And I write in my introduction the analysis, the old analysis of Max Weber in Sociology of Religion, that you have a prophetic type and a royal type. The prophetic type are the ones who are challenging the status quo, and the royal prophets later on, the kings and the priests, really he's talking about the prophets and the priests. The priests are the ones who maintain the status quo, at least in Weber's analysis. And it's interesting to think about who represents those roles in our society today. At any rate, hope you all have a good weekend, and please do try to get started with this reading so that you can begin to get stuff posted early in the week and not simply wait till the end. Take care.